Bob Marley is quoted as saying, "Better to die fighting for freedom than be a prisoner all the days of your life." And in the case of the Eastern Bloc, that is what some were thinking. After all, it's what happened with the Ukrainian and Polish guerrilla armies that fought their communist counterparts, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 that spawned the left book slang word of a tanky,
suck my,
as well as the more famous peaceful revolutions that occurred all over Eastern Europe. Well, all but one, of course. Hello everyone, and welcome to the first part of the Romanian Revolution video series, where today I will be discussing the days before the revolution, as well as what led up to what was the only violent revolution in the Warsaw Pact. Let's not waste any more time and jump right into this, shall we? Unlike most people living in the Western world, and even most of the Warsaw Pact, the 1980s were brutal for those that lived in the Socialist Republic of Romania. Nicolae Ceausescu, President of the Republic and General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party, had ruled with an iron fist with his Securitate, secret police acting as both his eyes and ears for the party, as well as his muscle, who would silence and arrest anyone who opposed Ceausescu's rule. However, while living under an oppressive socialist government was less than desirable, the secret police keeping tabs on the populace was only the tip of the iceberg, as Romanians had to deal with austerity measures at that time. During the 1950s and all the way until the 1970s, Romania under Ceausescu's rule had a surprising amount of economic growth. In fact, Romania's economy had been one of the fastest amounts of growth in the world at the time. Now, I'm obviously not trying to sound like an apologist for the communist Romanian government, but this is true. Comparing the GDP economic growth from 1940 to 1970 from a report done by Radu Coteciu and Vasile Nasoi for the North University of Baia Mare, Romania, Romania's economy jumped from just under $20 billion in today's money to just a little over $90 billion by the 1970s. But much like the economy under Leonid Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, the economy stagnated under Nicolae Ceausescu. This was caused mainly by Romania's preference in heavy industry at the time, as around 34% of the GDP had been invested into heavy industry. Some industries, such as petrochemicals and steel, had a production capacity higher than demand in the local and available external markets, resulting in underused capacities. In other words, the government of Romania's economy had begun to slow and stagnate due to the preference in a single industry, as well as the large amounts of unused inventory and the falsification of reports by government officials to make the economy look positive in the eyes of the socialist government under Ceausescu. What made things worse for the Romanian government, as it would later bite Ceausescu in the tuchus, is the same thing that caused the Yugoslav government to fall just as quickly: loans.
Okay, and just a couple of remaining items. Please indicate here if I look like a schmuck to you. I'm gonna say no. Great, then please check here and initial there.
In the 1970s, at around the same time the economy began to slow down, the Romanian government was awarded loans from Western nations, as Western nations encouraged Romania's acquisition of new technology for themselves. These loans were given based on political considerations. The debts of Romania to Western creditors rose from just $1.2 billion in 1971 to a peak of $13 billion in 1982. The 1970s energy crisis, combined with the increase in interest rates, and in the context of sluggish growth in the severe global recession of 1974, made Romania incapable of repaying its debts. In 1981, in order to pay its due debts, Romania requested a line of credit from the International Monetary Fund and adopted a policy to pay back all of its debt. Another thing Romania had done, as recommended by the IMF, was to reduce the amount of imports coming in and to increase the amount of exports leaving the country, in order to earn the money needed for the debt to be paid back. As Romania had intended to pay back all of its debt by any means necessary, this then started austerity measures in Romania. In other words, we can talk less about the economic side of this glaring issue in the Socialist Republic of Romania. In 1981, Nicolae Ceausescu started an austerity program without modifying the economic plans of the current 5-year plan that was in place at the time. Domestic energy resources were channeled towards the inefficient production of goods intended to be exported. Even basic necessities such as food, heating, electricity, and medical care were rationed and infrastructure was left to decay. Due to the austerity program, by 1983, the standards of living had fallen by 19 to 40%, according to IMF figures. As a result of the reduction of imports, food shortages had begun in the Socialist Republic of Romania due to Romania being a net importer of food. The amount for the loss in food was also not correctly estimated by foreign analysts supervising the situation in the Socialist Republic. With Romania in debt and austerity measures in place, the main goal of the Socialist Republic of Romania under General Secretary Nicolae Ceausescu was to rid itself of the debt it had collected at the time. This policy-making continued on well into the 1980s. However, with the iron-fisted government of Nicolae Ceausescu and his Securitate secret police combined with the lack of basic essentials to survive, these would be the catalyst for an uprising in Brasov. While the Stalinist country of Romania was the last to succumb to the many revolutions of 1989, the seeds for the Romanian Revolution began in 1986, as workers began to mobilize to protest Nicolae Ceausescu's economic policies in the country. Labor uprisings began to sprout through the towns of Cluj-Napoca, Iasi, with the largest of the strikes occurring in Brasov. Brasov was Romania's most industrially developed city, with over 61% of labor participating in industry. A skilled working class emerged in the 1960s as the communist government encouraged migrations from the more rural regions of Romania, such as Moldavia, to operate Brasov factories. Therefore, the industrial decline in Eastern Europe during the mid-1980s hit Brasov and its workers especially hard. On November 15th, 1987, a day that would normally occur with local elections, workers at the Steagul Rosu plant, a truck manufacturer, protested reduced salaries and the proposed elimination of 15,000 jobs in the city. Roughly 20,000 workers walked off the job and marched towards the communist headquarters of the city center. Firstly, the demonstrators loudly expressed wage claims. Then, they shouted slogans like "Down with Ceausescu," "Down with communism," chanting anthems of the 1848 revolution, "Down with the dictatorship," and "We want bread." Over 20,000 workers from the Brasov tractor factory, Hydromechanica factory, and a number of townspeople joined the march. The combined mob sacked the headquarters building and City Hall, throwing into the square portraits of Ceausescu and food from the well-stocked canteen. In a time of drastic food shortages, protesters were particularly angered to find festively prepared official buildings and food abundance in order to celebrate the local election victory. A massive bonfire of party records and propaganda burned for hours in the city square. By dusk, Securitate forces and the military surrounded the city center and disbanded the revolt by force. Though no one was killed, some 300 protesters were arrested. However, since the regime decided to play down the uprising as isolated cases of hooliganism, sentences did not exceed 2 years of imprisonment, which was a relatively moderate penalty in the Communist Penal Code. After 1990, up to 100 prison convictions could be documented so far, while others had been forcibly relocated throughout the country. Though the Brasov rebellion did not directly lead to revolution, it dealt a serious blow to the Ceausescu regime and its confidence in trade unions. Let's flash forward to 1989. It's the end of the 1980s. Ghostbusters 2 came out.
We came, we saw, we kicked its ass.
Reagan's out of office and Bush is now in. and the Soviet Union's embracing reforms faster than a Venezuelan Bolivar press in 2015. However, while much of the Eastern Bloc is cracking under pressure from the anti-communist populace, Romania has maintained its stance to its form of Marxism-Leninism adopted by its nationalistic General Secretary Nicolae Ceausescu, at least for most of the year of 1989. We will see, however, that this will change drastically for Mr. Ceausescu in December. Earlier in the year of March 1989, 6 former high-ranking Romanian Communist Party members published a letter critiquing the communist government of Romania. Addressed to President Nicolae Ceausescu, the letter was a left-wing critique of Ceausescu's policies. It appealed to the type of humanism supported by Soviet General Secretary at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, although the latter was not mentioned by name. The text of the letter was very clear in its practical demands and set a stark tone, particularly the part in which they compare Romania with Africa, hinting at a future of underdevelopment. This was the first major sign of a crack inside Romania in 1989.